The doors flew open with a loud crash. Kyle Morrison stood there breathing hard. His jacket was torn. His hair was messy, but his eyes burned with something that made everyone in the room go quiet. It was anger mixed with deep sadness, the kind that comes from losing everything that matters. The Grand Senate Hall stretched out before him like a massive cathedral. Crystal pillars reached up to a curved ceiling that showed the actual stars above. Each star represented one of the 7,000 worlds that belonged to the Empire. Beings from species that had traveled between stars for millions of years now turned to look at him. They watched this human who dared to interrupt their important meeting. Kyle did not care about their rules today. 3 days ago, his home planet of New Portland had burned. It was not destroyed by war or by accident. The Emperor himself had ordered ships to fire on it from space. The reason was a tax problem that any basic office worker could have fixed with a few minutes of work. But Emperor Vexthor did not care about the lives of what he called the lesser beings. 200,000 humans died in the fires. Kyle's wife Lisa was among them. So was their 7-year-old daughter Emma. They burned alive because of a paperwork mistake. The Emperor sat on his high throne at the far end of the hall. He was covered in scales like a giant lizard. His people, the Jakari, had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. They had crushed every rebellion. They had absorbed entire civilizations. They had even changed the laws of physics to help their empire grow. One angry human senator meant nothing to him. Kyle started walking down the center path. His boots made loud sounds on the polished floor. All the senators watched him with their mouths open. Nobody just walked up to the Emperor like this. There were rules and procedures that took weeks to follow. You had to ask permission through many levels of government before you could even request a meeting. The Emperor's voice filled the chamber. It was translated instantly into 1,000 languages through the computer chips in everyone's brain. He sounded annoyed and superior. "Human, you dare approach me without permission? Your species exists here only because I allow it. Go back to your seat before I have my guards throw you out." Kyle kept walking. He did not slow down or speed up. He just kept moving forward at the same steady pace. The Imperial Guards were huge warriors from many different warrior races. They moved to stop him, but something in Kyle's eyes made them pause. They had seen angry soldiers before. They had fought in many wars. But this was different. This was pure grief turned into a weapon. A thin alien named Priest Krell whispered quickly into the Emperor's ear. The Emperor pushed him away with one clawed hand. Then he leaned forward on his throne. "Senator Morrison, you are testing my patience. Say what you came to say, but do it from down there." Kyle stopped at the bottom of the steps that led up to the throne. When he spoke, his voice carried across the huge room without any microphone or speaker. It was clear and cold like ice. "Your Majesty ordered the deaths of 200,000 of my people 3 days ago. You murdered them. Not soldiers, not rebels, just regular people, families, children. You did this because your own government made a mistake with the numbers. You did this because you were too proud to admit someone working for you had made an error. My wife is dead. My daughter is dead. They are nothing but ash now because you could not be bothered to read a simple report." The hall exploded with shocked voices. People gasped and whispered to each other. Nobody talked to the Emperor this way. The punishment for being disrespectful was death. Sometimes they made the death slow and painful just to make an example. The Emperor's eyes got narrow. They reflected the light like melted gold. He stood up from his throne. He was massive, much bigger than Kyle. His shadow covered Kyle completely. "I am the Emperor. I do not explain my actions to servants. Your world broke Imperial law. You got what you deserved. This coalition exists because I allow it. These worlds are successful because I permit it. You, human, are nothing but dust shouting at a storm." The Emperor waved his hand and a hologram appeared in the air. It showed Earth, the home planet of all humans. It looked peaceful and blue against the black of space. "Should I teach you a better lesson? Your entire species can join your family in whatever afterlife you believe in." Something broke inside Kyle Morrison at that moment. Not the kind of breaking that makes you fall apart. The kind that makes you stronger because you have nothing left to lose. When he moved, he was fast. Faster than anyone expected from someone who did not care about dying anymore. His hand shot out and grabbed the Emperor by his fancy collar. The collar was covered in jewels and gold thread. It was worth more than entire planets. Kyle grabbed it like it was nothing and yanked hard. The guards finally reacted. They raised their weapons. But Kyle was already moving. He pulled the Emperor down from the throne. The ruler of 7,000 worlds stumbled down the steps. His feet tried to find balance, but the steps were too smooth. The entire galaxy seemed to stop breathing. Kyle dragged the Emperor across his own throne room. The Emperor's claws scraped against Kyle's jacket but could not tear through it. The jacket was designed to protect against the vacuum of space. A few claws were nothing. The Emperor made angry sounds, but Kyle did not care. He pulled the massive creature toward the doors like he was dragging a heavy bag. The guards should have killed Kyle immediately. Their weapons could turn him into nothing before he could blink. But they just stood there. They were frozen. Their Emperor, the being they thought was as permanent as gravity itself, was being dragged across the floor by one human who had nothing left to lose. Every senator in the room stood up. Some tried to use their communication devices. Others just stared with their mouths open. Ambassador Greg Holland from Mars tried to run forward. He shouted for Kyle to stop. Kyle pushed him aside without even looking at him. He kept walking. He kept dragging the Emperor toward the door. The galaxy held its breath and watched a man who had lost everything show them that even gods could be humbled. Emperor Vexthor, ruler of 7,000 worlds, was being dragged across his own throne room floor by a human. His claws kept scratching at Kyle Morrison's jacket, but they could not cut through the tough material. The Emperor made sounds that were part anger and part confusion. For 3,000 years he had ruled with absolute power. Now he was being pulled like a sack of grain by someone who no longer feared death. The Imperial Guards stood frozen. Their training had prepared them for many things: assassins, bombs, rebel attacks. But not this. Not their Emperor being hauled across the floor by a grieving father. Their weapons could kill Kyle in less than a second. They could turn him into atoms before his brain could register pain. But they just stood there with their weapons pointed but not firing. The throne room had turned into chaos. Senators from 1,000 different worlds jumped up from their seats. Some grabbed their communication devices to call for help. Others just stared with wide eyes. Ambassador Greg Holland of Mars tried to chase after Kyle. He was shouting for him to stop and think about what he was doing. But Kyle pushed past him without slowing down. Nothing was going to stop him now. Priest Krell's voice cut through all the noise. It was high and desperate. "Guards! Kill him! Kill the human now! This is treason! This is complete madness." But something stopped the guards from pulling their triggers. Maybe they knew that killing Kyle would also risk hitting the Emperor since they were so close together. Maybe they were just too shocked to think straight. Or maybe deep in their warrior hearts they recognized something in Kyle Morrison. They saw justice demanding payment for a terrible crime. Kyle dragged the Emperor toward the main doors. They passed rows of senators who pressed themselves back against their seats. They acted like being too close to this act might get them in trouble too. The Emperor's crown fell off his head. It was an ancient piece that his family had worn for 3,000 years. It hit the floor with a ringing sound and rolled away. Nobody moved to pick it up. The marble hallways of the Senate building stretched ahead. The walls were lined with statues of previous emperors. Each one was frozen in poses that showed dignity and power. Kyle Morrison pulled the current emperor past all of them. The difference was impossible to miss. The statues stood tall and proud forever. The living emperor twisted and clawed at the floor, trying to stop being dragged but failing. People began filling the hallways. Staff workers, visiting leaders from other worlds, office workers. They all came to see what the noise was about. News spread through the building faster than light. Within minutes, beings across the entire galaxy knew what was happening. A human senator was dragging their emperor through the halls of power. The heavens themselves seemed to hold still and watch. The emperor kept switching between threats and begging. "Your world will burn for this. Every human settlement will be destroyed. I will erase your entire species from the universe." Kyle said nothing. His silence was somehow more frightening than any words could be. Then the emperor tried a different way. His voice became softer, almost friendly. It was a tone nobody had ever heard from him before. "Morrison, please stop this. We can talk about compensation. I can give money to help rebuild New Portland. Your family's deaths were unfortunate, but this behavior helps nothing." Kyle's grip got tighter on the emperor's collar. When he finally spoke, his words were so quiet that only the emperor could hear them. Their names were Lisa and Emma. "My wife studied star maps. My daughter wanted to fly spaceships. They had names. They had dreams. They were not just numbers in your reports. They were real people. They walked through the Hall of Signatures. This was where the founding document of the Galactic Coalition was kept in a case made of pure diamond. The document talked about justice and rights for all thinking beings. It said the powerful should protect the weak. Those were nice words that had been ignored for hundreds of years whenever they became inconvenient. Senator Nala Quinn stood in their path. She was a human who had served in the Senate for 30 years. Her face was white, but her voice stayed calm. Kyle, please. Think about what you are doing. Think about Earth. Think about every human colony that depends on our position in this government. You are destroying everything we built. Kyle stopped and looked into her eyes. For a second, something like regret showed on his face. Our position? Nala, we never had a real position. We had permission to exist. We were here because they thought it was amusing to let us stay. My daughter is dead because this creature ordered the deaths of thousands when a simple sorry would have been enough. If our survival depends on accepting that, then maybe we do not deserve to survive. He started walking again. He pulled the Emperor past Nala, who could only stand there with tears running down her face. The crowd following them had grown to hundreds of people. Security forces ran around trying to control the situation, but their orders made no sense. Different commanders told them different things. Nobody had ever planned for something like this. How do you plan for the impossible? Kyle dragged the Emperor toward the main entrance of the Senate building. The huge doors began to open automatically. Beyond them was a massive plaza made of polished stone from 100 different worlds. It stretched out empty under the light of 3 suns. Beyond that, the eyes of 7,000 worlds were watching. They waited to see what would happen when grief met power and refused to back down. The Emperor tried one more time to break free. He dug his claws into the floor. The claws left long scratches in the expensive marble. But Kyle was stronger than he looked. Grief had given him a strength that came from having nothing left to lose. He pulled harder and the Emperor slid forward, his claws screeching against the stone. They reached the doors and stepped into the bright sunlight. The plaza was filled with thousands of beings from every corner of the galaxy. They had all come to see history being made. Some cheered. Some cried. Many just stood silent, watching as everything they thought was certain fell apart before their eyes. Kyle Morrison pulled the Emperor to the center of the plaza. There stood a tall crystal monument called the Monument to Unity. It caught the light from the 3 suns and scattered it in rainbow colors across the crowd. Today, that beautiful light seemed to judge everyone watching. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see what would happen next. The plaza stretched wide like an arena. Its floor was made of polished stone from 100 different worlds. In the center stood the Monument to Unity, a tall crystal tower that caught light from the 3 suns and threw it across the crowd in bright colors. Today that light felt harsh and judging. Kyle Morrison hauled Emperor Vexthor into the open air. The sound from the crowd was like nothing the galaxy had heard in thousands of years. Thousands of beings had gathered. They came from every species in the coalition. They filled the plaza and the buildings around it. They pressed against security barriers that bent under their weight. News had spread fast and everyone wanted to witness this moment. Some people cheered. Some people cried. Many just stood in shocked silence. They watched as everything they believed about their government fell apart in front of them. Kyle stopped at the base of the monument. He let go of the Emperor's collar. The Emperor stumbled and caught himself against the crystal surface. For the first time in 3,000 years of rule, the Emperor's scales had lost their shine. He looked old and small and mortal. The Imperial Warfleet hung in orbit above them. Their weapons were charged and ready to fire. Admiral Betty Chen of the Human Defense Forces had sent a message to Kyle's brain chip. Her voice was tight with panic. She warned him that 23 Jakari warships had aimed their weapons at the plaza. They were waiting for the Emperor to give the order. They could turn this entire place and everyone in it into hot gas in seconds. Kyle Morrison, who had nothing left to lose, felt strangely calm. He spoke. Every broadcast system in the sector carried his words across the stars. 3 days ago, this being ordered the deaths of 200,000 humans. Not soldiers, not rebels, regular people, families, children. He did this because his own government made a mistake and he was too proud to admit the fault. He did this because he could, because power without anyone checking it is just tyranny wearing a crown. The Emperor straightened up. Some of his dignity came back. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3,000 years of authority. I am the Emperor. I do not explain my actions to servants. Your world broke imperial law. What happened was justice. This coalition exists because I allow it to exist. These worlds are successful because I permit them to be. You human are nothing but dust shouting at the wind. Kyle reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data chip. He held it up for the cameras. Billions of beings across the galaxy were watching. This contains the final messages from New Portland. Would you like to hear them? Would the galaxy like to hear what 200,000 people sound like when they know they are about to die for nothing? He turned on the chip. The sounds of New Portland's last moments filled the plaza. Screams, prayers, parents trying to calm their scared children. The crackling sound of fire from orbit turning the air into flames. It lasted 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds burned themselves into the minds of every being who heard them. When the recording ended, the silence was complete. Even the Emperor seemed smaller because of it. His ancient eyes flickered with something that might have been shame, if he was capable of feeling such a thing. Ambassador Blake Norton pushed through the crowd. He had spent 40 years working in galactic politics. His face was gray. His usual calm was gone. Your Majesty, I formally request an imperial investigation into the New Portland incident. The facts need to be examined. Justice demands it. The Emperor's head snapped toward Blake. Fury returned to his eyes. You dare demand an investigation from me? I am the law. I am justice. My word is final in everything. But even as he spoke, other voices joined Blake's. A senator from the Kalari group of worlds. A representative from the Mindweaver species. One by one, members of the Galactic Coalition who had spent hundreds of years accepting imperial orders without question, found their courage. The Emperor looked around the plaza. For perhaps the first time in his impossibly long life, he saw something he had never thought possible. His power was being questioned, not by rebels with weapons, but by civilized beings demanding answers. He saw the foundation of his empire developing cracks. Priest Krell appeared at the Emperor's side. His thin body was shaking with rage. He pointed a clawed finger at Kyle. This human has attacked the Emperor. The punishment is death. His entire species must be made an example of. Kyle met Krell's eyes. Then he looked past him to the Emperor. Do it, kill me. Kill Earth. Kill every human in the galaxy. But know this. Every species watching right now will remember what happened here. They will remember that you murdered my family over a paperwork error, and when someone questioned you, you responded with more death. They will remember that your empire is held together not by justice or wisdom, but by fear and violence. And empires built on fear always fall apart eventually. The Emperor stared at Kyle for a long time. Around them, the galaxy watched and waited. The Imperial fleet stayed in orbit with hot weapons but did not fire. The moment stretched tight like a wire about to break. Then Emperor Vexthor did something that shocked the galaxy more than anything Kyle Morrison had done. He bowed his head slightly. It was small but clear. It was the first time in 3,000 years that an emperor had admitted he might be wrong. There will be an investigation into the New Portland incident. If my government made an error, we will pay for the damages. This I order. The plaza exploded into noise, but Kyle Morrison stood still. His face showed nothing. He had come here expecting to die. Instead, he had done something far more dangerous. He had made a god admit it could make mistakes. The monument behind them caught the light and threw it across the crowd. The rainbow colors seemed brighter now, like something new was being born from the ashes of the old system. The galaxy had been holding its breath. Now it could breathe again. But everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same. Kyle looked up at the sky where the warships waited. He thought of Lisa and Emma. He hoped that somehow, wherever they were, they knew that their deaths had not been meaningless. That justice, even delayed, was still possible. That even the most powerful being in the universe could be forced to answer for his crimes. 5 years passed, 5 years where the galaxy learned to work in a new way. The Emperor's word was no longer absolute law. It was now just the starting point in an ongoing discussion. Kyle Morrison lived on Earth in a small house that looked out over the Pacific Ocean. He spent his days writing and teaching at the local university. He tried to make peace with the memory of who he had been before New Portland burned. He avoided interviews and public events. He was content to let history judge his actions while he focused on the simple task of learning how to live again. But history was not content to leave him alone. The Galactic Coalition had changed dramatically in those 5 years. The Kalari group had not left the Empire, but they had negotiated a new agreement that limited Imperial power over their internal business. 17 other species followed their example. This created a mixed system of semi-independent regions within the Empire. The Senate, once just a rubber stamp for imperial orders, had grown into an actual governing body with real power to check the Emperor's authority. The change had not been smooth. There were 3 attempted coups by imperial hardliners who wanted the old ways back, 2 assassination attempts against senators who wanted reform, a short but brutal war in the outer territories where loyalist forces tried to take back absolute imperial control. But slowly, painfully, the galaxy was learning to govern itself through agreement rather than command. Emperor Vexthor had aged visibly in those years. His scales had become dull. His movements had grown slower. Some whispered that the stress of maintaining power in this new era was killing him. Others said he was simply old, and even Jakari emperors could not rule forever. On a spring morning in Kyle's 6th year of exile, a shuttle came down from orbit and landed on the beach near his house. He watched it approach with a mixture of acceptance and curiosity. He had been expecting something like this. The past always comes back eventually. The person who came out of the shuttle was not someone Kyle recognized. She was young by the standards of her species. Her scales were still bright with youth. She wore the formal robes of an imperial messenger, but she carried herself with a humility that would have been impossible 5 years ago. She introduced herself as Shara Vex, daughter of the Emperor. She had come with a message from her father. They sat on Kyle's porch looking out at the endless ocean. Shara spoke carefully. "My father is dying. The doctors say he has maybe 6 months. He wants to speak with you before the end. He asks if you would come to the capital, not as a prisoner or someone begging for mercy, but as a witness to what your actions started." Kyle studied her face. He looked for lies or threats. He found neither. Why? What could he possibly want from me? Shara's face softened into something that might have been sadness, understanding perhaps, or forgiveness, or simply to see the man who broke his empire and forced him to become something better than he was. "I cannot speak for my father's heart. I can only deliver his request." Kyle thought about the invitation for 3 days. Part of him wanted to refuse. He wanted to let the Emperor die without the closure he was looking for. But another part of him, the part that still remembered who he had been before grief and rage took over, knew that healing required facing the past. He returned to the capital for the first time in 5 years. The city had changed. Where imperial banners had once flown from every building, now they shared space with the flags of member worlds. The buildings looked the same, but the feeling was different. People moved with less fear. They spoke with more confidence. The invisible weight of absolute power had lifted. It was replaced by something messier but more real. Shara took him to the imperial palace. They walked through halls he had last seen while dragging her father toward justice. Now he walked them freely. The guards who watched him pass showed respect rather than hate. They knew who he was. Everyone in the galaxy knew who he was. He was the man who had challenged a god and lived to tell about it. Emperor Vexthor received him in a private room, not the grand throne room. It was a simple space with windows that looked out over the gardens. The Emperor sat in a chair, not on a throne. The difference was striking. He looked small and weak and mortal in a way that would have been unthinkable before. They looked at each other in silence for a long moment. Then the Emperor spoke. His voice did not have the thunder it once had. "Thank you for coming. I was not sure you would." Kyle sat in the chair across from him, keeping eye contact. I almost did not. "Why am I here?" The Emperor looked out the window at gardens that had been tended for 1,000 years. "I have ruled for 3,000 years. In that time I believed myself to be fair. I believed that power justified itself, that my word was law because I had the strength to make it so. Then you dragged me through my own halls. The galaxy watched, and I saw myself through other eyes. I saw a tyrant who had convinced himself he was a just ruler." He turned back to Kyle. His ancient eyes reflected something that might have been regret. "Your family died because I was too proud to admit a mistake. 200,000 lives ended because I could not be bothered to check the details. I am dying now, Morrison, and I find myself wondering how many others died over the centuries because I valued my pride more than their lives." Kyle felt something twist in his chest. This was not the conversation he had expected. He had come prepared for excuses or justifications, not confession. "Are you asking me to forgive you?" The Emperor's laugh was dry as dust. "No, I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I am asking you to be a witness. To tell the galaxy that in the end, I understood what I had become. That I tried in what little time I have left to build something better than the empire I inherited." They talked for hours. These two beings who had become connected by tragedy and its results. The Emperor spoke of reforms he had put in place, of powers he had given up, of the coalition he was trying to change from an empire into something that might actually deserve respect. Kyle listened, and in listening he found some measure of peace he had not expected to find. The investigation took 6 weeks. 6 weeks where the Galactic Coalition lived in barely controlled chaos. The Emperor had gone back to his palace. He was surrounded by guards who now looked at him differently. The certainty that had always defined their service was gone. It was replaced by something more complicated, something almost like doubt. Kyle Morrison spent those weeks in a detention center. It was technically a prison cell, but it worked more like protective custody. The Empire did not know what to do with him. Kill him and risk making him a hero that people would remember forever? Let him go free and admit he was right? The system was paralyzed. Power had met justice for the first time and did not know how to respond. Human representatives visited him often. Ambassador Blake Norton brought news from Earth. Kyle had become something between a hero and a disaster back home. Survey numbers showed 80% of humans supported what he did, but the diplomatic workers saw him as a bomb that almost destroyed everything they had spent hundreds of years building. Nala Quinn visited during the 3rd week. She sat across from Kyle in the plane visiting room. Her eyes were red from not sleeping. The coalition is breaking apart. 17 member species have filed formal complaints about the Empire going too far. The Kalari group is threatening to leave completely. The trade networks are disrupted because nobody knows what the new rules are anymore. "You broke something, Kyle. I am not sure it can be fixed." Kyle looked at her. This woman had given her whole life to keeping humanity safe through careful talking and measured words. Maybe it needed to be broken. Maybe something better can be built from the pieces. Nala's laugh was bitter. "You sound like a rebel." "But you are not a rebel, Kyle. You are a sad father who let his pain drive him to do something incredibly reckless. Maybe I am both." The investigation results came on a Tuesday morning, Galactic Standard Time. The report was 3,000 pages long. It detailed every part of the New Portland incident. The conclusion was harsh and clear. The Imperial Finance Ministry had indeed made an error. The disputed taxes were the result of a wrong calculation in how different currencies converted. New Portland had not broken imperial law. They had simply been unable to pay a bill that was impossible to calculate correctly, due to the government's own mistake. The report further said that the decision to use orbital weapons was way too extreme for the supposed offense. 200,000 civilians had died because someone in the imperial government had made a math error. And the Emperor had been too busy to look at the details before ordering people killed. The galaxy read the report. Something fundamental shifted in how 7,000 worlds saw their government. The Emperor was not perfect. The Empire was not fair. The system they had all accepted as natural law was revealed to be nothing more than 3,000 years of habit and fear. Emperor Vexthor spoke to the Senate 3 days after the report came out. He stood before all the representatives. His posture was stiff. His face showed nothing. The speech had been written and rewritten many times. Every word was chosen carefully for political impact. The investigation has finished. The destruction of New Portland was an error. We will pay money to the surviving families and to the human government to help rebuild. Those responsible for the mistakes will be punished. This empire admits its error. The words should have been historic. An emperor admitting a mistake was something that had never happened before. But to Kyle Morrison, watching from his cell through a video feed, the words felt empty. Lisa and Emma were still dead. No amount of money would bring them back. Punishment for nameless workers did nothing to fix the system that had allowed their deaths in the first place. The Emperor continued speaking. His voice got harder. However, the actions of Senator Kyle Morrison cannot be ignored. He attacked the Emperor. He stopped the government from working. He caused chaos across the coalition. Such behavior cannot be allowed no matter what caused it. Here it comes, Kyle thought. This is where power fights back. Where the Emperor punishes the man who made him look weak. And the galaxy learns that justice has limits. But the Emperor's next words surprised him. Therefore, Senator Morrison will lose his position and will be banned from holding any government job. He will not go to prison because of the extreme circumstances that caused his actions. The human representatives have accepted these terms. Kyle sat back shocked. No prison, no execution, just exile from politics. It was the lightest possible punishment. And in being so light, it showed just how much power had shifted. The Emperor could not afford to make Kyle into a hero by killing him. He could barely afford to punish him at all without risking the fragile peace that had settled over the coalition. That evening, Blake Norton came to take Kyle from the detention center. The old ambassador's face was tired but relieved. You are free to go. There is a ship waiting to take you back to Earth. I suggest you go quietly and do not talk to reporters. Let this moment pass. Kyle collected his few belongings and followed Blake through the building's corridors. As they reached the exit, he stopped and looked back. He could see the building that had held him. Beyond it were the tall towers of the Senate complex. Did it matter? What I did? Did it change anything? Blake thought about the question. Then he nodded slowly. Yes. You showed the galaxy that the Emperor could be challenged. You proved that grief and justice matter more than rules. Will it lead to permanent change? I do not know. But you broke the spell that kept everyone quiet. Sometimes that is all it takes. They walked toward the waiting ship. Kyle Morrison left the halls of power forever. He carried the memory of his family. He also carried the knowledge that even gods can be made to answer for their sins. The galaxy had watched him drag an emperor through the Senate halls. And in that moment of silence, everything had changed. As the ship lifted off and climbed toward the stars, Kyle looked down at the planet below. Somewhere down there, the Emperor sat on his throne, but that throne felt less stable now. The foundation had cracked, and cracks once started tend to spread. As the light faded from the windows and the gardens grew dark, Kyle prepared to leave. He stood at the door and looked back at the dying Emperor. Their names were Lisa and Emma. I need you to remember that. They were people, not numbers. Everything that came after started with them. The Emperor nodded slowly. I will remember. And when I am gone, I hope others will remember both your family and the lesson their deaths taught us all. That power without checks is tyranny. And tyranny, no matter how long it stands, will eventually fall to those brave enough to demand better. Emperor Vexthor died 6 weeks later. His daughter Shara became the new emperor. She was the first emperor to rule under the new constitutional agreement that limited imperial power and protected the rights of all member species. She ruled with wisdom and humility. She always remembered that power was not a right but a responsibility. Kyle Morrison returned to Earth and lived another 40 years. He never tried to get back into politics, but he taught many students about justice and the importance of speaking up against wrong. He spoke often of Lisa and Emma. He made sure their memory lived beyond the tragedy that had taken them. In the Senate Hall, they built a memorial. It was not a big statue or impressive structure. It was a simple metal plate. It had the names of the 200,000 who died on New Portland. Lisa and Emma Morrison's names were at the top. Below them, a single line was carved into the metal. Here, we remember those who died so that the galaxy might learn that even the powerful must answer for their actions. Every senator who passed that memorial would stop for a moment. They remembered the day a sad father hauled an emperor through these halls. They remembered that justice matters more than power. It did not matter what world they came from or what species they belonged to. The lesson was the same for everyone. The changes that followed were slow but steady. More species demanded and received autonomy over their own affairs. The Senate gained real legislative power. A system of courts was established that could review imperial decisions. The absolute monarchy that had ruled for 3,000 years transformed into something resembling a constitutional empire. There were setbacks. Old habits died hard. Some imperial officials resisted the changes. Some worlds were comfortable with the old system and feared the new uncertainty. But the direction was clear. The galaxy was learning to govern itself through law rather than decree. Kyle watched these changes from his quiet house by the ocean. He read the news feeds. He saw the reports of Senate debates that actually mattered now. He watched as species that had been silent for centuries found their voices. Sometimes reporters would contact him asking for interviews. He always declined politely. His students at the university knew his story. Everyone did. But in his classroom, He was just Professor Morrison who taught political philosophy and occasionally told stories about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it seems impossible. One day, a young student asked him if he regretted what he had done, if he thought the price had been worth it. Kyle thought about the question for a long time before answering. I did not do what I did to change the galaxy. I did it because my family was dead and I needed someone to answer for it. The changes that followed were not part of some grand plan. They happened because other people found courage I did not know I was giving them. Do I regret it? No. But I would trade every reform, every improvement, every positive change to have my wife and daughter back. That is the truth. Sometimes the right action comes from the worst pain. The galaxy watched in silence that day, not the silence of fear or oppression, but the silence of change, the silence of old certainties crumbling and new possibilities being born. It was the silence of 7,000 worlds holding their breath as they witnessed something they thought impossible. A single human had grabbed an emperor. He had dragged him through the halls of power. And the empire had not collapsed. It had transformed. That transformation was messy and incomplete and ongoing, but it was real. Years later, long after Kyle had passed away from old age, historians would debate the Morrison incident. Some would call it the catalyst for the democratic reforms. Others would argue the changes were already coming and Kyle just accelerated them. Still others would focus on the personal tragedy that sparked it all. But for the ordinary citizens across 7,000 worlds, the lesson was simpler and more powerful. They learned that authority could be questioned, that grief mattered, that 200,000 lives were not acceptable collateral damage for bureaucratic convenience. They learned that even the most powerful being in the universe could be forced to admit a mistake. The memorial in the Senate Hall became a site of pilgrimage. Families who had lost loved ones to imperial actions would come and stand before the names. They would place flowers or small tokens. They would touch the metal plate and feel connected to others who had suffered under absolute power. And somewhere, in whatever exists beyond this universe, perhaps Lisa and Emma Morrison knew. Perhaps they understood that their deaths, as senseless and tragic as they were, had become a turning point. Not because death should ever serve a purpose, but because sometimes grief demands justice loudly enough that the universe has no choice but to listen. Their names would not be forgotten. The memorial ensured that, but more importantly, they would be remembered as people. Lisa, who studied the stars. Emma, who dreamed of flying among them. Two humans among billions whose lives mattered enough that when they were taken unjustly, someone refused to accept it. That refusal echoed across the galaxy. It changed governments. It rewrote constitutions. It gave voice to the voiceless and power to the powerless. Not all at once. Not perfectly, but enough. The galaxy had watched in silence as Kyle Morrison dragged an emperor through the Senate halls. In that silence, they found their own courage. They learned that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, that even when power seems absolute, it rests ultimately on the consent of those it governs. And when that consent is withdrawn by one brave soul who has nothing left to lose, everything changes. That silence was not empty. It was full of possibility. It was the sound of an old order ending and a new one beginning. It was the sound of the galaxy learning that humanity, for all its youth and seeming weakness, possessed something the ancient powers had forgotten: the willingness to say no, the courage to demand better. The strength that comes not from weapons or technology, but from the simple human conviction that some things matter more than survival. The galaxy watched. The galaxy learned. And the galaxy was never quite the same again.